Oracle of the Forgotten. 2 visits to the council. Ratham the Destroyer tried to make arrangements to see the twin stars. However, the requests were denied. Being unable to do much else, the two decided to go forward with Void's original plan, the Throne of Kings. Despite the previous promises of the council, they attempted to refuse to place the throne within the tower. It was the presence of Wrath and his insistence that the former king could still take down any member of the council that finally found their ears working properly. The council allowed the Throne of Kings to be placed in a chamber near the council halls. Once the two had left, they ordered the entire floor of the council moved and that section of the building sealed until further notice. While Ratham the Destroyer were in the castle, the twins were kept far away. The council didn't understand the predicament, though. The presence of the 2 elders triggered a partial awakening in the 2 youths. They began to feel their nature was different than they had been told, different than the council had stated. The 2 began to feel the presence of creatures like themselves, not just the Father Star had known, but another as well. While the Destroyer felt he wasn't strong enough, his presence alongside a more powerful warrior made waves through the energies of the castle. Star had been rebellious, but had recently seemed to break to the constant pressures of her training. She appeared to accept that her father was a liar and had stolen her away from the gods, that she was one of them, corrupted and manipulated to think she was something else entirely. Feeling the presence of a second being like her father proved that he was not the last of a dead species seeking revenge. If there were 2, there certainly must be more. Her twin, on the other hand, was not so fortunate as to even know his history. The presence of these 2 beings nearly put him into a frenzy. He had been taught that it was his duty to end them, to stop them from harming the ancients. Instead, he was assigned to watch over the room of some stray and wayward thing he hardly ever interacted with. He had been told a time or 2 that they were siblings, but he found it rather difficult to believe. He knew she'd been stolen away by the Destroyer and had been told for ages how she had been corrupted by the void and negative energies. Normally, things like this were not his duty. He honestly had no interest in knowing anything about this creature they had locked away for the time the 2 were visiting. He spent most of his time engaged in fully ignoring her and any requests she made. In fact, he stood guard and allowed the other guards to deal with taking care of her. Despite a familiar energy, he really wanted nothing to do with it. Now that he could sense these 2 elders, he wanted to know only his victory, until something changed. For a brief moment, he felt a thread tying him back to one of these 2 strangers, deeply dark, mixed with a shimmering light. It seemed so familiar, and for a moment, he doubted. Only a moment. He all too soon dismissed it as a lie. He could easily sense that the woman within the sealed room was energetically bound to one of the 2. Whoever she was clearly tied to the soul bindings of the stranger. It only made him hate her more. It was towards the final day the 2 elders were in the realm that he finally took the time to listen to the words that were coming from within the room. Like no other, in a way no other was created. Those words meant nothing to him. He ushered her to silence again, and the girl said nothing more. Star was tired of her time in the cell. It was clear whoever was outside was not going to listen. She felt something he could clearly not. She knew him. She recognized him. As he scanned the energies tying her to the 2 elders, she began to have visions. As much as she longed to know his name, she knew who he was. After all, they were family, so how could he not see the connections? Maybe it was her own visions that allowed it. It was all she could assume, because he was clearly not experiencing the same that she was. Once the 2 elders left, everything seemed to return to normal. The second star resumed his work as a guard and did all he could to stay focused on his duties. The name for him was lost ages ago, so we'll just call him Saul. The visits by the elders left him uneasy. There was some uncanny familiarity, but those who raised him insisted it was mere trickery. Try as he might to believe that, something wasn't quite feeling right for him. He did what he could to ignore it. He only hoped it would fade away with time. While Saul continued his duties and training, Star continued her rebellion, though much quieter now. Knowing her father was alive, despite what she'd been told, had made her bolder. She began to form a plan for her own freedom and her brother should he choose to come. Still, the plan wasn't quite clear, and she was called to the council hall for meetings, lectures, and basically be told she had another program to take on to learn her place as one of the youngest gods. During these times, the humans were mostly at peace with the rise of their new young king. He seemed to be doing well even after his advisor left their lands. The council was becoming anxious. They were pushing harder than ever to establish some sense of control over the human situation. They temporarily recalled all of the gods from the human world, demanding that they return except for the hands of the council. Those 6 would stay behind and continue to work on the new order as a way of hopefully eventually manipulating humans to take enough control again. They began to hear rumors, though. Rumors that would at first be ignored, until the lords of the outer realm began to die one by one. Not permanently, not all of them at least, but gradually there were reports of ones that had simply stopped existing. A final death was terrifying to the immortals, and they weren't sure if this was the work of the elders or a stray human they hadn't finished off yet. They noticed that the ability, or at least understanding of humans to accomplish these slayings was extremely limited. The ancients had begun to start forming their own armies and ranks of powerful humans, but humans had proven quite resistant as adults. It was difficult to tell if they even had the potential for this ability when they were small. They needed access to the human world again. Over the coming years, they noticed Star had finally stopped her random attempts to escape. While they thought this was a final victory, they would eventually learn the truth. Curious as ever, she had been following the stories of the invaded human cutting their way through the lands of the angels. A small and simple creature like that had so much power. What would it mean for the goddess that they say she is? She was considered near her adulthood these days, despite the ancients treating her like a child. Star was still occasionally attempting to talk to Saul, who seemed to utterly despise her. Somehow it didn't bother her too much. Something in her nature made her just ignore his apparent hatred. She was growing in popularity around the palace of the gods. In her case, it was mostly just her willingness to help the servants when none of the gods would even address them with kindness. She was growing, learning, and developing skills quickly. She'd also found a few guards who were willing to allow her to train, even though it was forbidden for her to learn to use a weapon. Back to the human king. He'd taken to calling himself the Wanderer. Stories of him were moving quickly through the lands. His journey started with traveling back to the lands of the New Order, where he convinced one of the gods there to give him transit to the lands of the councils. The god wasn't exactly willing, but it seemed the fear for his own life was a good enough incentive to waste a little magic on a human he figured was going to end up dead. This wanderer was now moving through each of the high kingdoms, the 7 virtues and their rings of light. It was likely it wouldn't take him long to traverse the lands at the rate he was traveling. It took some effort. Star finally caught one of the messengers before the council could make them swear to silence. What she learned was a surprise to her. A human with king's blood. Why did it seem so familiar? It had been long enough she couldn't quite remember the stranger who'd been in her father's home. It never even crossed the elder's mind. A time later, she found another messenger. This one told her the human had reached the 4th wall. It meant he couldn't be far from one of the Stellarium gates that would bring him to the gardens of the council building itself. She wasn't sure if she could do it, but she heard a rumor about some gods being able to speak directly to the minds of mortals. Her lack of experience in many things left her unsure of herself and her abilities. As she looked out from the balcony of the great tower, she whispered into the wind, "Ask them about the Stellarium gate." What she didn't know was that the mortal she was thinking of actually heard her voice. It was a clear voice, yet somehow hidden upon the winds. It had been almost buried in the many senses he was experiencing. He could feel them, all the creatures around him, their confusion and apprehension. Yet the sound of the woman's voice was new, something he'd not heard before with his extra senses open. There were only men nearby. In fact, he had just entered the chamber of the Lord of the Fourth Gate. As he stood before the man, he hardly heard the demands of why he was there. Stellarium Gate. The words were more of an echo of his trying to understand the woman's voice. The lord of this realm seemed shocked at first. It was a thing no human should have known. He'd fought his way this far. Maybe someone had mentioned it before getting here. He knew the mortal wouldn't get far. He didn't have the celestial energies required to open that gate. The lord of the land taunted him. Weak mortals. They were always weak, but for a price he could give him access to the next realm. The gate, however, could never be. The human chose to fight, taking down the lord to nearly nothing, his life force waning in the ends of the battle. The wanderer stared at the fallen angelic lord, his eyes narrowing as he asked yet again for the gate. The immortal relented, moving his hands towards a circular design on the floor. The tiles here were covered in runes and sigils, a sign of magic that had been denied to the humans. The circle's runes began to form before a single beam of light raced out of the center of it. It shot towards the ceiling, then dropped back to the edges of the ring on each side, and circling around until it made a complete dome of energy. As he had arranged, the mortal let the angelic lord live, but warned him if this was a trick, he would come back and finish them all. He stepped through the glowing gate. Every fiber of his being felt like it was on fire for a moment. The gate had not been designed to accommodate mortals, but it did its best to move him safely through towards the gardens of the tower. After all, it had been commanded to let him through. The portal opened in the gardens as promised. The human glanced around. There was some eerie sensation as he saw the stars and planets nearby, galaxies hanging in the skies. There seemed to be nothing to protect them from that, but the area was safe and the air was breathable. Beings seemed to wander from other portals, moving off in a single direction. As he traced their path with his eyes, he saw the tower. It was huge and appeared to be in the middle of construction of new wings to be built up larger still. The tower itself was still a castle, looming tall before him with great doors. The walk wouldn't take long, and the human started to move forward. He was covered in blood, both dried and not. He began to bandage a cut along his left arm while continuing his walk. If this is the place, he would take as long as necessary to find them. A part of him half hoped that they would actually have sense to listen to him, unlike the others he'd encountered. If the lords reflected their masters, he was prepared to fight the ancients of this place as well. The human started on his way through the towers. It was almost as if he were invisible. No one acknowledged him. They walked past him, ignoring his requests and comments, even just his words. It wasn't until he grabbed a guard and pulled them aside that he had any answers. The council has just been moved to the highest level of the central tower, and no one can enter unless they are summoned. He released the guard and thanked him before starting on his way. The guard seemed a little confused, but went about his duties without another word. Star knew that she had to go to the council hall, but she really wasn't in the mood. Her attire was still set for her time training in the ground earlier in the day. She sighed before changing back to the expected white dress they would demand she wore. She never felt it went well with matching her hair, but it didn't matter to them. The woman was quite sure the council was going to tell her soon that she would have to marry. They'd been hinting at it for a while. They even introduced her to a potential suitor or two. Their favorite was fairly good-looking, but there was something about him that left her wanting nothing to do with him. She never quite learned what, but the fact that they were calling her again made her realize she may have to step up her plans to leave. As she approached the council hall, she saw a stranger pushing at the doors. Her eyes centered on him directly. Star noticed the sword first. Her eyes settled on it for a bit. Familiar. It was just all too familiar. The woman shook her head, trying to drive off whatever visions were attempting to sneak into her mind. No, this is not the time for that. You can't open them unless you've been summoned. Her voice echoed through the hall. It wasn't as if the occupants were unaware of his attempts to enter, yet there were no guards here. That voice, though, it was the same one he'd heard before. Even if he didn't understand much about magic, that voice was definitely one he couldn't forget. He turned to look at the woman. I am here to talk with them. His direct nature actually sort of impressed her. Star smiled a moment, but then she felt something tug through her. Her smile quickly faded as she tried again to stop her visions from taking over her mind. She told him that it was impressive, a human reaching their realms, especially this tower. Some higher beings try and still never make it to this place. She was now more determined to know two things: why he seemed familiar to her, and why he had come at all. He told her that his village and his people suffered, that his own family had been torn apart by the council. It was that moment that he noticed her eyes change, from the blue-green they were to a solid, sheer white shimmer. He'd seen it before. His adopted mother had visions as well. The woman with the snake tattoos. Her mention of it was something he hadn't expected. He told no one, and none outside of his village would even know. If he hadn't seen someone having visions before, he would have instantly assumed that this was a trick by the gods. In the void was born death. She paused, shaking her head. She seemed a little disoriented a moment or two, then reached for the door. He started to speak, but fell silent when she opened the door. Instead of his words, she spoke again. Let them hear your words and maybe suffer for the death of my friend. She knew it was only a reincarnation, one of many for certain. Her eyes were shifting back to normal again. Still, as the two walked into the council hall, she knew what would come next. If anything, it would help them both. All she could really do was hope. The council refused to speak with the human twice, despite her insisting that she would forfeit her time with them. Finally, she looked over at the council, then back to the human. You will speak with him, or you will not leave this place alive. The voice was hers, but the words were very much not. Her eyes had gone white again, and she was losing control over her own senses. She stepped back, moving closer to the wall, and allowing the human to take space in front of the council. The ancients didn't know what the girl was or what she wasn't capable of. She'd shown talent in a lot of small things, but didn't seem to show the ability her father had. Still, they thought she was the threat. If only they knew. But they continued to deny the human, and she knew that they would soon learn. Since it was clear the human wasn't leaving, the council agreed to let him speak. It was rather obvious they didn't have much intention of listening. Despite that, the human first requested and then outright demanded that they recall the remaining gods from his world. The ancients laughed. A mortal making demands was nothing to them. Still, it was hard for Star not to notice someone had called Saul into the meeting room as well. Saul was considered their only good weapon against other gods, immortals, and mortals alike. There was no reason to bring him here unless... Star finally had enough. Call off your dog and let him speak. The others turned to her. For the past decades, she'd stayed mostly quiet, not having the audacity she seemed to suddenly develop since the two elders had entered their realms. Despite the continued talks, it was clear the council would do nothing. They told the human to return to his realms. They would open the portal for him, and his kind was not welcome here. Star had wanted the portal, that was all. But watching the council's inaction was angering her. They didn't act, they didn't listen, they only deemed him lesser and refused all he requested for his people. She opened up her mouth to speak, but was cut off by something that sounded more menacing than anything she could have said. If you will not remove them, I'll make room for those who would. After, I will remove them myself. The human's speed was almost unmatched. He flew forward, drawing the blade he held with an instant, and driving it through the seat of the body of the god nearest to him. While not a fatal blow, the point had more than been made. As he went to draw his sword back out from where it had been stuck, Saul flew into action. He spread two great wings, formed of light and lightning, and rushed towards the mortal. Star didn't even think. While she never knew that they could have wings, she rushed to the nearest statue and pulled a spear from it, then spun and ran to intercept her brother. As her spear blocked his sword from hitting the human, the three seemed to exchange only a brief glance. The warrior was clearly confused that any of them had stepped in on his behalf. He didn't need it. He would have dodged that blow, but the fact that anyone made an effort made him half smile before continuing his assault on the council. Many fought, and valiantly. They teamed up against him, hoping to drop the mortal where he stood. The human was oddly strategic, pulling them away from one another to try to face them in as small of groups as possible. While he fought them, the two stars continued to fight one another. As the gods began to fall, Star replaced her spear with a sword. This was the most familiar weapon she could find for her own hands. She fought back against the much better trained warrior and was doing well despite the cuts to her own body. The color of her blood only seemed to enrage Saul. He knew what she was, an elder. No wonder he'd never felt right in her company. The banter between the two went on to her trying to tell him that he was an elder and they had just lied to him, that the two could go free and never cross paths again if he would just stand down. He would not. The human's great battle against the gods was destroying pillars and statues around the main hall. The doors were locked by the spell that let none enter without a summons. Saul finally made his last strike against the offending elder witch, as he had called her. He rushed her, pinning her against the wall with his sword through her stomach. The woman blinked, staring a moment at the sword, then directly into the eyes of her brother. She let her own sword fall, the sound of it echoing through the chamber. May you find truth in the next life. Her words were spoken in such a cold tone that her twin paused a moment. Every stray weapon in the room flew up from the ground and into her brother's body, somehow barely missing her own. He dropped to the floor, and as he did, she grabbed hold of his sword. She slowly removed it from the wall and herself, then carried it as she walked towards the gods who were still fighting the Wanderer. While badly wounded, her right hand over her stomach, she rushed one of them. She swung her blade, cutting down the leader of the council, who dropped to the ground. The council members stopped as if frozen. Another fell to the last strike of the wanderer, who had been mid-swing. The silence of the chamber was broken when the woman finally spoke again. "It was him, not me. I took one. He took 2/3 of your number. Let us leave and leave his people alone." Her words were more than just a threat. She was wounded, tired, and fairly sure she wouldn't survive the ordeal. She only wanted to have her freedom before this body quit working, and she had to either make or find another. The humans said nothing. The remaining council finally agreed to remove the gods of the new order from the human world. They agreed to keep the gods away from the humans so they could grow and develop on their own. Both the human wanderer and the elder star walked through the portal back to the human lands. First the mortal, then second the elder, who was finally able to free herself with the help of a rather unlikely ally. For now, humanity would find a short time of peace, but how long could peace remain? Both hoped that the council would stop their meddling.